My name is Detective Thomas Anderson, and I have been working with the Philadelphia Police Department for 14 years now, and in all those years I have investigated countless murders and violent crimes, but there is one case that haunts me more than any other because it is not just about murder, but about the most primal human emotion there is, and that is a mother's love for her children and what happens when that love is violated in the most horrific way possible. I met Ratna Patel on a warm summer evening in 2019 when we responded to a domestic violence call at a small house in South Philadelphia, and when we arrived, we found two women covered in blood, and one of them was older and wounded, and the other was younger and holding a knife, and the scene was chaotic, but what struck me most was the look in the younger woman's eyes, and it was not fear or rage, but something else, and it was a kind of cold satisfaction. We arrested both women and separated them and took them to the station, and as I processed Ratna Patel's arrest, I noticed something, and her hands were steady, and she was not crying or protesting, and she just looked at me and said, "Detective, I need to tell you what happened, and I need you to understand why I did what I did." I said, "Ratna, you are being charged with attempted murder and assault with a deadly weapon, and you have the right to remain silent." And she said, "I know my rights, but I do not want to remain silent. And I want to tell you everything because the world needs to know what that woman did to my babies." So I sat down with Ratna in the interrogation room, and I turned on the recorder, and I said, "Okay, Ratna, tell me your story." And she took a deep breath and began to speak, and over the next 5 hours, she told me the most heartbreaking story I have ever heard. Ratna Sharma was born in Gujarat, India in 1986, and she came from a lower middle class family, and her father was a shopkeeper and her mother was a housewife. And Ratna was the youngest of 4 daughters, and in Indian culture, having only daughters is sometimes seen as a burden because of dowry traditions and wedding expenses, and Ratna grew up hearing people pity her father for not having a son. But Ratna's parents loved all their daughters equally, and they made sure all 4 girls got an education, and Ratna was a bright student, and she dreamed of becoming a teacher, and when she was 21 years old, her parents arranged her marriage to Vikash Patel, who was a young man from their community who had immigrated to America. Vikash was 26 years old and worked in a factory in Philadelphia, and he lived with his mother, Kamal Ben Patel, in a small row house, and the marriage was arranged through family connections. And Ratna had only met Vikash twice before the wedding, but he seemed nice enough, and more importantly, going to America meant a better life and opportunities. Ratna and Vikash got married in 2015 in a traditional ceremony in India, and then Ratna moved to Philadelphia, and she was nervous but also excited because she thought she was starting a new chapter of her life, and she thought she would have a loving husband and a supportive mother-in-law and maybe children of her own someday. But from the very first day Ratna arrived in Philadelphia, she realized that life was not going to be what she had imagined. And Kamal Ben Patel was a bitter woman in her late 50s who resented having a daughter-in-law in her house, and Kamal Ben had very traditional views, and she believed that a daughter-in-law was basically a servant who should do all the housework and show complete obedience. Kamal Ben would make Ratna cook and clean and do laundry, and if anything was not perfect, she would criticize Ratna harshly, and she would say things like, "In my day, daughters-in-law knew how to work properly, or you are lazy and useless," and Ratna tried her best to please her mother-in-law, but nothing was ever good enough. Vikash was not much help, and he worked long hours at the factory, and when he came home, he was tired, and he did not want to deal with conflict, and when Ratna tried to talk to him about how his mother treated her, he would say, "You need to adjust, and she is my mother, and you need to respect her," and Ratna felt trapped. A year into the marriage, Ratna got pregnant, and she hoped that having a baby would make things better, and that Kamal Ben would soften and be a loving grandmother, but instead Kamal Ben became obsessed with the gender of the baby, and she kept saying it better be a boy, and we need a boy in this family. When Ratna gave birth in 2016 to a baby girl they named Arya, Kamal Ben was deeply disappointed, and she did not even want to hold the baby, and she said, "This is bad luck, and you need to have a son next." Time and Ratna was hurt, but she loved her baby girl with all her heart, and Arya was beautiful with big brown eyes and a sweet disposition. Ratna thought that maybe the next baby would be a boy, and then Kamal Ben would be happy. But in 2017, Ratna gave birth to another girl they named Priya, and Kamal Ben was angry, and she said, "What is wrong with you, and why do you keep having girls?" And Vikash was also disappointed, though he tried to hide. It and Ratna felt like she was failing, even though she knew logically that she had no control over the gender. Then in 2018, Ratna got pregnant again, and Kamal Ben said this better be a boy or else, and Ratna prayed every day that it would be a boy because she wanted peace in the house and she wanted her mother-in-law to accept her. But when the baby was born, it was another girl, and they named her Meera. Kamal Ben exploded with rage when she found out it was a third daughter, and she screamed at Ratna and said, "You are cursed, and you have ruined my son's life, and how will we afford 3 weddings and 3 dowries?" And Vikash said nothing and just looked away, and Ratna held her newborn baby and cried. After Meera was born, Kamal Ben's attitude toward Ratna became even worse, and she would make comments every day about how the 3 daughters were a burden and about how much they would cost and about how Vikash should have married someone else, and Ratna tried to ignore the comments and focused on taking care of her 3 little girls. Arya was 2 years old, and she was a happy toddler who loved to dance and sing, and Priya was 1 year old. And she was quiet and observant and always watching everything with her big eyes. And baby Meera was just a few months old, and she would smile whenever Ratna held her, and Ratna loved her daughters more than life itself. But Kamal Ben seemed to hate the little girls, and she would never help take care of them, and she would complain if they cried or made noise, and she would say, "These girls are nothing but trouble," and sometimes she would look at them with such coldness that it made Ratna uncomfortable. One day in August 2018, Ratna had to go to a doctor's appointment, and she asked Kamal Ben to watch the 3 girls for a few hours, and Kamal Ben reluctantly agreed, and Ratna left the house feeling anxious, but thinking it would only be for a short time, and what could go wrong? When Ratna returned 3 hours later, she walked into a nightmare, and all 3 of her daughters were lying motionless at the bottom of the stairs, and Kamal Ben was standing there, and she said there was an accident, and they fell down the stairs, and I tried to catch them, but I could not. Ratna screamed and ran to her babies, and she picked up Arya, and she was not breathing, and then she grabbed Priya, and she was cold, and then she looked at baby Meera, and she knew, and all 3 of her children were dead. Ratna collapsed on the floor screaming and crying, and neighbors heard and called 911, and the police and ambulance came, and the paramedics tried to revive the children, but it was too late, and they were pronounced dead at the scene, and Ratna was hysterical, and she kept saying, my babies, and someone needed to sedate her. The police investigated, and Kamal Ben told them that she had been in the kitchen, and the girls had been playing upstairs, and she heard a crash, and came running and found them at the bottom of the stairs, and she said it was a terrible accident, and she was devastated. The detectives looked at the scene, and it was plausible that 3 small children could have fallen downstairs, especially if they were playing near the top, but something seemed off, and one detective asked how all 3 children fell at the same time, and Kamal Ben said they were holding hands, and when one fell, they all fell. They did autopsies on the 3 girls, and the medical examiner found injuries consistent with falling downstairs and broken bones and head trauma, and the deaths were ruled accidental, and no charges were filed. Ratna was destroyed, and she could not eat or sleep or function, and she blamed herself for leaving her children with Kamal Ben, and Vikash tried to comfort her, but his comfort felt empty because he did not seem as devastated as she was, and life went on for everyone else, but for Ratna, time had stopped. They had a funeral for the 3 girls, and it was heartbreaking, and there were 3 tiny caskets, and Ratna could not even stand up during the service, and she kept fainting, and people said it was the worst tragedy they had ever seen, and how could 3 children die like that? After the funeral, Ratna went through the motions of living, but she was dead inside, and Kamal Ben showed no emotion, and she just went back to her routine, and sometimes Ratna would catch her mother-in-law looking at her with something like satisfaction, and it made Ratna's skin crawl. A few weeks after the funeral, one of their neighbors, Mrs. Chen, came to Ratna when she was alone, and Mrs. Chen looked uncomfortable. And she said, "Ratna, I need to tell you something." and I do not know if I should, but I cannot keep quiet anymore. Mrs. Chen said that on the day the girls died, she had been in her backyard, which was next to the Patel house, and she heard Kamal Ben's voice coming through the window, and Mrs. Chen said I heard her say something in Gujarati, and I do not speak the language, but I know a few words, and I heard her say the word for poison. Ratna felt her blood run cold. And she said, "What else did you hear?" And Mrs. Chen said, "I heard children crying, and then it got quiet, and then later I heard the ambulance, and Ratna, I think something bad happened, and I think it was not an accident." Ratna thanked Mrs. Chen, and after she left, Ratna sat alone and started thinking about that day and about how Kamal Ben had acted and about how all 3 children died at the same time and about how Kamal Ben had wanted them gone because they were daughters, and she started to realize the horrible truth. Ratna went through Kamal Ben's belongings when she was out of the house, and in a locked drawer she found a small bottle that was labeled as rat poison, and the bottle was half empty, and Ratna's hand shook as she realized what this meant. And her mother-in-law had murdered her 3 babies. Ratna wanted to go to the police, but she had no proof, and Mrs. Chen had only heard words through a window, and the autopsies had showed injuries from falling, and Kamal Ben had been careful, and Ratna knew that no one would believe her and that Kamal Ben would get away with murdering 3 innocent children. Ratna confronted Vikash, and she said, "Your mother killed our daughters," and Vikash looked shocked and said, "That is crazy, and do not say such things." And Ratna said, "I found poison in her drawer," and the neighbor heard her, and Vikash said, "You are imagining things because you are grieving, and you need to stop making accusations." But Ratna saw something in Vikash's eyes, and she saw guilt, and she realized that Vikash knew or suspected, and he was choosing to protect his mother instead of getting justice for his daughters. And in that moment, Ratna realized that her husband was complicit, and he had known, or at least had not wanted to know. Ratna felt something break inside her, and she had lost her 3 babies, and the police would not help, and her husband would not help, and the woman who murdered her children was living in the same house and sleeping peacefully at night. And Ratna decided that if the system would not give her justice, she would get it herself. Over the next 6 months, Ratna changed, and she stopped crying and stopped being the meek daughter-in-law, and she became cold and calculating. And she started planning her revenge, and she knew she needed to be smart because she could not let Kamal Ben get away with what she had done. Ratna started researching poisons and methods, and she read about how people committed murders and got away with it, and she learned about forensics and autopsies, and she planned every detail carefully because she was going to make sure that both Vikash and Kamal Ben paid for what they did to her babies. Ratna's plan was simple but effective, and she would kill Vikash first because he was complicit in the murder of their daughters, and he had chosen his mother over justice, and then she would confront Kamal Ben and make her admit what she had done before taking her revenge. Ratna started buying sleeping pills over the counter, and she would buy them from different pharmacies so no one would notice, and she collected them slowly over several months, and she ground them into a fine powder and kept them hidden in a small container. During this time, Ratna pretended that everything was normal, and she cooked and cleaned and acted like the obedient daughter-in-law, and Kamal Ben thought she had won and that Ratna had accepted what happened, and Vikash seemed relieved that Ratna had stopped accusing his mother, and life in the Patel household returned to a tense normalcy. But every night Ratna would go to the room where her daughters used to sleep, and she would look at their empty beds and their toys and their clothes, and she would cry silently and promise them that she would get justice for them and that their deaths would not be in vain. In March 2019, Ratna decided it was time to execute the first part of her plan, and one evening, she made Vikash his favorite meal, and she added the crushed sleeping pills to his food, and she made sure to give him a very large dose, and they ate dinner with Kamal Ben, and Ratna watched as Vikash ate everything on his plate. After dinner, Vikash said he felt very tired, and he went to lie down, and Ratna waited, and about an hour later she went to check on him, and he was unconscious and breathing very slowly, and Ratna did nothing, and she just watched as her husband's breathing became more and more shallow until finally it stopped. Ratna called 911 and screamed that her husband was not breathing. and the ambulance came and tried to revive him, but Vikash was pronounced dead, and the paramedics asked what happened. And Ratna said he came home from work complaining about chest pain, and then he collapsed. The medical examiner did an autopsy and found a massive amount of sleeping medication in Vikash's system, and it looked like a suicide or an accidental overdose. And since Vikash had been showing signs of depression after losing his 3 daughters, the death was ruled as likely suicide, and Ratna played the part of the grieving widow perfectly. Kamal Ben seemed genuinely upset about losing her son, and she cried at the funeral, and Ratna stood next to her and felt nothing but cold satisfaction, and she thought, that is, one down, and now it is your turn. After Vikash's funeral, it was just Ratna and Kamal Ben living in the house together, and the tension was palpable, and Kamal Ben seemed to sense that something had changed, and she became nervous around Ratna and would watch her carefully. Ratna waited a few weeks, and then one evening when they were alone in the house, she decided it was time to confront Kamal Ben, and she walked into the living room where her mother-in-law was sitting, and she said, "Kamal Ben, I know what you did." Kamal Ben looked up and said, "What are you talking about?" And Ratna said, "I know you murdered my daughters, and I know you poisoned them and then threw them down the stairs to make it look like an accident." Kamal Ben's face went pale, and she said, "You are crazy, and they fell down the stairs, and it was an accident." And Ratna said, "No, it was not, and the neighbor heard you talking about poison, and I found the poison in your drawer, and you killed my babies because they were girls." Kamal Ben stood up, and her face twisted with anger, and she said, "So what if I did, and they were a burden, and 3 daughters would have ruined Vikash's life, and someone had to do something?" Ratna felt rage explode inside her, and she said, "They were innocent children, and they were my babies, and you had no right." And Kamal Ben laughed bitterly and said, "I had every right, and I am the elder, and I know what is best for this family. And those girls would have brought nothing but shame and expense." Ratna lunged at Kamal Ben and grabbed her by the throat, and Kamal Ben fought back, and the 2 women struggled, and Kamal Ben was older, but she was strong. And she pushed Ratna away and said, "You killed my son, and I know you poisoned him." And Ratna said, "Yes, I did, and he deserved it for protecting you." Kamal Ben grabbed a lamp and swung it at Ratna and hit her in the shoulder. And Ratna stumbled back, and then she saw a kitchen knife on the table, and she grabbed it, and Kamal Ben's eyes went wide, and she said, "You would not dare." But Ratna was beyond caring, and she thought about Arya's laugh and Priya's curious eyes and baby Meera's smile, and she thought about how this woman had taken them away forever, and she said, "You murdered my children, and now you will pay." Ratna stabbed Kamal Ben in the stomach, and Kamal Ben screamed and fell backward. And Ratna stabbed her again in the chest, and Kamal Ben was bleeding heavily. And she looked up at Ratna and said, "You will go to prison for this." And Ratna said, "I do not care." Kamal Ben was still alive and bleeding, and she said with her last breaths, "Yes, I killed them, and I would do it again, and they were worthless girls." And Ratna said they were worth more than you ever were. The neighbors heard the screaming and called the police. And when we arrived, we found Ratna standing over Kamal Ben with the bloody knife in her hand, and Kamal Ben was still conscious but badly wounded, and we arrested both women. Kamal Ben was taken to the hospital and survived her injuries, and we took Ratna to the station, and that is when she told me everything, and she confessed to killing her husband and to stabbing her mother-in-law, and she told me about her 3 daughters and about what Kamal Ben had done. After Ratna finished her story, I sat there in silence for a long time because I did not know what to say, and legally Ratna had committed murder and attempted murder, and she would face serious charges, but emotionally, I understood why she had done it, and I could not imagine the pain of losing 3 children. I said, "Ratna, I need to investigate your claims about what Kamal Ben did to your daughters." And Ratna said, "Please do, and exhume their bodies and test for poison, and you will find the truth." We did exactly that, and we got a court order to exhume the bodies of Arya, Priya, and Meera Patel, and we did new autopsies with specific tests for poisoning. And what we found was shocking and all. 3 girls had high levels of rat poison in their tissues, and the poison had been in their systems when they died. The medical examiner said the original autopsies had focused on the trauma from the fall and had not tested for poison and the falls down the stares had been real, but the girls had already been dying from the poison, and Kamal Ben had staged the fall to cover up the poisoning. We arrested Kamal Ben in the hospital and charged her with 3 counts of first-degree murder, and she tried to deny it at first, but when we presented the toxicology reports and told her that we had testimony from Ratna about her confession, she finally admitted it. Kamal Ben said that the 3 daughters were a burden and that in her culture sons were valuable and daughters were expensive, and she had not wanted Vikash to suffer the financial burden of raising 3 daughters and paying for 3 weddings. So she had decided to get rid of them. The coldness with which Kamal Ben described murdering 3 innocent children was chilling, and she showed no remorse, and she seemed to genuinely believe that she had done the right thing. And I had been a detective for 14 years, but I had never met anyone as evil as Kamal Ben Patel. Both women went to trial, and the cases were heard separately. And Kamal Ben's trial came first, and the evidence against her was overwhelming, and the toxicology reports, and her own confession, and the testimony about her motive, and the jury found her guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder after deliberating for less than 2 hours. At Kamal Ben's sentencing, the judge said that this was one of the most heinous crimes she had ever seen, and that Kamal Ben had murdered 3 innocent children in cold blood and had shown no remorse, and the judge sentenced Kamal Ben to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kamal Ben showed no emotion when the sentence was read, and she was led away in handcuffs, and I felt some satisfaction knowing that she would spend the rest of her life in prison, but it did not bring back those 3 little girls. Ratna's trial was more complicated because while she had clearly committed murder, the circumstances were extraordinary, and her defense attorney argued that she had been driven to temporary insanity by grief and by the knowledge that her children's murderer was living freely and would never face justice. The prosecutor argued that Ratna had committed premeditated murder and that she had carefully planned and executed the killing of her husband, and that, regardless of her emotional state, she had broken the law and needed to be held accountable. The jury heard testimony about the deaths of the 3 girls and about how the system had failed Ratna by ruling the deaths accidental, and about how Ratna had been living with her children's murderer, and several jury members were crying by the end of the trial. The jury found Ratna guilty of second-degree murder for killing Vikash and guilty of attempted murder for stabbing Kamal Ben, but they also recommended leniency due to the extreme circumstances. At Ratna's sentencing hearing, the courtroom was packed with people, and some were supporters who believed Ratna was a victim who had been pushed too far, and others were people who believed that murder was never justified, regardless of the circumstances. The judge said that this was an incredibly difficult case, and that while she had sympathy for Ratna's loss, she could not ignore that. Ratna had taken the law into her own hands and had committed murder, and the judge sentenced Ratna to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 15 years. Ratna stood and accepted the sentence without emotion, and she said, "I have no regrets, and my daughters can rest in peace knowing their murderer was brought to justice, and I would do it all again." As they led Ratna away, I felt a profound sadness because this whole situation was a tragedy, and 3 innocent children were dead, and a mother had been driven to become a murderer, and a son had died protecting his evil mother, and an elderly woman would die in prison, and there were no winners. I visited Ratna in prison a few months after her sentencing because I wanted to check on her and see how she was doing, and when she came into the visiting room, she looked calmer than I had ever seen her, and she said, "Detective, thank you for coming," and I said, "How are you?" holding up, and she said, "I am at peace." Ratna said that every night she dreams about her daughters, and in her dreams they are happy and playing, and they tell her that they understand why she did what she did and that they forgive her. And Ratna said that knowing Kamal Ben is suffering in prison makes it easier to endure her own imprisonment. I asked Ratna if she had any regrets, and she said only that she did not act sooner, and that maybe if she had killed Kamal Ben right away, her daughters might still be alive. And I said, "Ratna, you could not have known what Kamal Ben was planning." And Ratna said, "I should have known, and a mother is supposed to protect her children, and I failed." I told Ratna that she did not fail and that she had been betrayed. by the system and by her family, and that she had done everything she could, and Ratna said, "Thank you, detective, but I will carry this guilt until the day I die." Today, Kamal Ben Patel is 65 years old and is serving life without parole at a women's correctional facility in Pennsylvania, and she has shown no remorse for murdering her 3 granddaughters, and she maintains that she did what was necessary, and other inmates who know her story avoid her because even hardened criminals find child murder unforgivable. Ratna Patel is 37 years old now and has served 4 years of her 25-year sentence, and she is a model prisoner and works in the prison library and helps other inmates learn to read and write, and she has said that if she gets parole after 15 years, she wants to work with organizations that help women escaping domestic violence. The case of Ratna Patel and her 3 daughters changed how our department investigates child deaths, and we now automatically test for poisoning in all suspicious child death cases, even when the cause seems obvious, and because of this case, we have caught 2 other instances of parents poisoning their children. I think about Arya and Priya and Meera often, and I think about how they deserve to grow up and have lives and have dreams, and how they were robbed of that by their own grandmother who was supposed to love and protect them, and I think about Ratna and how she was driven to murder by a system that failed her. This case taught me that justice is not always simple, and that sometimes the law fails people, and when it does, they are left with impossible choices, and Ratna chose revenge over living with her children's murderer, and she will pay for that choice for the rest of her life. I also learned that cultural beliefs about gender can be deadly, and that the preference for sons over daughters still exists in some communities, and it can lead to neglect and abuse, and in this case to murder, and we need to do more to protect children from these harmful beliefs. Ratna told me once that she does not consider herself a murderer, and she said, "I was a mother who lost everything and did what I had to do to get justice for my babies. And I cannot judge her for that because I have never walked in her shoes, and I hope I never have to." This story is a tragedy with no happy ending, and 3 innocent children are dead, and a mother is in prison, and an evil woman is locked away forever, and nothing can undo what happened, and all we can do is learn from it and try to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Thank you for listening to this heartbreaking story, and if it made you think about justice and revenge and the lengths a parent will go to protect their children, then maybe some good can come from this terrible case. And if you want to hear more stories, subscribe, because I have many more that need to be told.